My teacher is a sociopath. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Tutor Storytime. Today, the true story of a student I met a couple years ago, back in 2017, and her misfortune in having one of the worst teachers ever. Before I begin the story, let me just kind of tell you where I'm coming from. As a tutor, I get a lot of requests from students who don't have the best of teachers, and, that makes sense. If you have a really good teacher, then you probably don't need a tutor. So, I still do get plenty of students who do have good teachers, but usually they have other goals, like they want to learn ahead of the class, or they want to learn something that isn't currently being offered by their school, or they're not allowed to take it because of some weird prerequisites that are required of them or whatever. So it's not always the case that the students I have necessarily have bad teachers, but it is more common. So, keep that in mind, because when I say that this teacher is a sociopath, I don't use that word lightly. This teacher really takes the cake. She's not just a well-meaning but inexperienced or incompetent teacher. She really just didn't mean well at all. And it took me a while to realize that, as you'll soon see in the story. But yeah, I think that's enough for my perception of things, if you will. Let's go ahead and start with the story. So, for purposes of confidentiality, I'm never going to use real names in any of these stories, so get used to that. The student in this case will just refer to her as Rose, and as for the teacher, we will call her Viola, also known as Dr. Thorne. If you can figure out which game I'm referencing with those fake names, then feel free to post your guess in the comments. Anyway, I guess I'll start with where we started our first meeting, or actually before the first meeting, the initial tutoring request. So it was one 2017 summer where I got a request that I had gotten before. It was a request from a mother who wanted some tutoring for her daughter for AP Chemistry. Not a very unusual request, because AP Chemistry is notorious for being a course that teachers have a hard time finishing in time for the AP exam. It's just that the course has a lot of content, and that's been a problem for a very, very long time. They've kind of solved the problem recently, but I don't agree with how they solved it. They basically gutted the course by removing chapters that I think shouldn't have been removed, but I'll probably post a video ranting about that some other day. Anyway, it was just a very typical request at the time. Summer AP Chemistry tutoring to kind of learn ahead and make sure that the student finishes in time, even if the class can't, make it. So yeah, we scheduled basically like a consultation, a first meeting, just to kind of figure out the situation a little bit more and decide what our game plan was going to be. So I meet Rose and her dad at a Starbucks one day. She has this big binder full of old worksheets and stuff from her older sister when her older sister took chemistry. And, I had a look through the materials. I had a look at the textbook. I asked my typical first meeting questions. What math level are you at? What math course are you taking in the upcoming school year? And have you ever had a chemistry course before? And, just those typical questions that I will usually ask during the first session, unless there's like a meeting before the first session, which this was. And yeah, we basically decided that we didn't really need all of those worksheets. I had a look at the textbook, and I would soon come to realize that it was one of the worst chemistry textbooks I've ever seen. Maybe I'll do a separate video on that textbook too. But, we came up with our game plan and we just started. I just basically started essentially homeschooling her for the first few weeks/months and, we just progressed basically through in the same order as my chemistry videos. We started with classifications of matter and nomenclature and significant figures and all that stuff. And eventually I started seeing the summer assignments. See, this teacher was a bit different because she actually had summer homework for her students before school had even started, which, I took that at first as a sign that this teacher was really serious and that she understood the AP chemistry problem of not having enough time to fully teach the course. So at first I was quite impressed with this teacher. Anyway, the summer assignments weren't anything too bad. We were ahead of the curve. We were going through the summer assignments rather quickly and still continuing to learn stuff ahead of the class even starting. But then school started and we still had a pretty good lead and we were still building on it. But every now and then we would get these curveballs that kind of started getting in our way. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But as an example, and I kind of welcomed this at first, there was a problem when we got to the quantum mechanical model of the atom. When we got to the energy levels, the orbitals, and all that stuff, there was a problem that the teacher had for the students, which I was quite happy with. It was asking students to use limits to prove that the difference in energy between successive energy levels would gradually shrink and eventually diminish to zero over time. And if you don't know what that means because you haven't had any calculus, that's fine. Limits aren't too hard to teach to students who knew algebra, which is what they were required to know to sign up for AP Chemistry to begin with at that school. So, even though it was something that the students most likely hadn't learned before, it wasn't too hard to show them the concept, and I took it as a sort of, just a side thing, sort of digging into the math. I felt that this teacher kind of was following my philosophy of, well, I wouldn't call it a philosophy, but she acknowledged my common complaint about chemistry teaching, which is that chemists are not mathematicians. If you've seen my chemistry videos, you've heard me say this over a dozen times, I'm sure. For those of you who are hearing it for the first time, what I mean when I say chemists are not mathematicians is that in chemistry teaching, we typically don't seem to care enough about the math to explain it to our students and really make them, understand the math. We just kind of tell them, here's a formula, don't ask why it works, just use it. And I feel like that makes chemistry harder to understand. I feel like you get less understanding out of that when you don't follow the math. Because by following the math, I don't want to go into a whole video essay about this, but when you understand it on a mathematical level, it becomes intuitive, it becomes easy to remember because, well, you don't have to memorize it anymore. It just makes sense. The math makes it make sense. So, yeah, at this point I was still being fascinated by some of the things that the teacher was doing, and I was actually quite impressed. I had taken the perspective that this teacher just wanted to challenge her students, and I didn't feel like anything was wrong with that at the time. Then there was this minor red flag. Rose at one point told me that Dr. Thorne had heard that a tutor was involved and she wasn't happy about it. And again, this was something that I didn't take too seriously at the time because, sometimes teachers can be a bit, how do I say this, territorial. Sometimes teachers feel like a tutor might show students how to do things in a way that isn't the way that they want things to be done, and I guess that just makes grading harder for them or whatever. It introduces some obstacles, and I kind of get it, but at the same time, it's like you don't get to dictate which method to use when you've got multiple methods that can be used to solve the same problem. And, whatever method works best for the student. Well, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't say whatever method, because some methods are just kind of mindless shortcuts that result in students not learning anything. So I wouldn't say whatever method, but any good method, any method that shows that the student knows what they're doing should count. I don't know if that was particularly why well, actually, I do know that wasn't the particular reason why she was bothered by the involvement of a tutor. We'll get to that later, I suppose. But yeah, point was, she wasn't happy about a tutor being involved for whatever reason. There are all sorts of reasons why teachers might not be happy about that. Maybe I'll explore that some more in a separate video. So many separate videos are being spun off of this one video already. I feel like I'm going to be overwhelming myself with more work than I can handle soon. Anyway, back to the story. So, this was all what I would call the before the realization phase. This was before I realized that there was something off about this teacher. So now we enter phase 2, where I'm starting to see more and more patterns. I'm starting to see more and more red flags and signs that this teacher may not be as well-meaning as I had initially thought she was. So one thing that stood out was the frequency of corrections. And what I mean by that is sometimes Rose would come to me for a tutoring session and we'd start off with correcting a quiz or even an exam. Like the whole class did horribly and the teacher was letting them do corrections and then, resubmit for a higher score. And, in the beginning, this was kind of okay with me, but when we got like halfway into the semester and this was still going on and the students were still having trouble, I started to realize that there's got to be something off. In the beginning of school, when students have had all summer off and, their minds haven't fully woken up yet, I can see that. I can see the need for corrections there. But when you're halfway through the semester and this is still happening, that's a sign that the students aren't really learning or aren't really understanding what they're learning. So, frequent corrections, those were a thing. As I looked at some of those quizzes and exams, I also started to notice another problem, which is there were always these kind of esoteric questions that definitely weren't high school level chemistry questions. Even some of the college students would probably have trouble with some of the questions that were written on some of these quizzes and exams I saw. And part of it was just the wording would make it really hard to, kind of figure out what it is you're doing, what kind of situation you're even dealing with to begin with. And, some of them had me scratching my head. And I couldn't dismiss them as just the teacher trying to be challenging anymore. It was starting to border on the ridiculous. There was a reason that these questions were popping up, which we'll talk about later. There was a reason for these highly esoteric questions that almost nobody in the class was able to figure out. Almost nobody. That'll become relevant later. But yeah, frequent corrections. That was one big red flag that something was off about this teacher. Aside from the frequent corrections, Rose had mentioned to me on several occasions how Dr. Thorne had told her that she thought Rose would get a 3 on the AP exam. And for those of you that aren't familiar with AP exams, the highest possible score is a 5, and a 3 is kind of like getting a C on the exam. And, in the beginning, I didn't really think much of this comment because sometimes teachers just don't know their students that well, and sometimes that student that you think isn't paying attention and isn't understanding will surprise you. And I thought that was just another case of that the teacher was just underestimating her student because she didn't know her student well enough yet. But as I continued to hear Rose mention this over and over again throughout the year, I started to suspect that maybe this was a deliberate attempt by Dr. Thorne to undermine Rose's confidence, and eventually, by the end of this realization phase, I just kind of decided that that was exactly what was going on. But yeah, that was another, big red flag that, got me closer to my conclusion that this teacher was not necessarily a well-meaning teacher. What else did we have? What was another big red flag? We started losing our lead. So I mentioned before how we were kind of ahead of the class. We were working a couple chapters ahead of the class for quite a while, and then somewhere towards, I would say, the end of the first semester or the beginning of the second semester, I can't quite remember, but somewhere around that time is when we started losing our lead. And we were losing our lead because we kept on getting lost in unnecessary side topics that Dr. Thorne felt like bringing up. And this was doubly frustrating because these side topics were, one, rather difficult, and two, they were irrelevant to the course. They weren't part of the course. It's one thing if you can teach the whole AP course and then also teach some extra stuff on top of that. I have no problem with that. In fact, I encourage that, and that's what I like to see teachers doing. But this teacher was doing these unnecessary side topics instead of covering what they were supposed to be covering, and the class was behind schedule at this point. At this point in the school year, they were behind schedule. So one of these side topics that the teacher decided to get lost in for a few days, maybe even weeks, was molecular orbital theory. Some of you might remember the chemistry video in which I mentioned molecular orbital theory, and you might remember me clearly calling it the stuff of nightmares. Molecular orbital theory requires a really, really high level of math to truly understand. Math that is typically not taught before you're in college, and it's just not worth digging into, so it's not part of the AP chemistry curriculum. Yet this teacher insisted on covering it and confusing the students even further, even though they were already having enough trouble with the material that they were supposed to be learning for the class. What else was going on with these unnecessary side topics? Oh, here's another frustrating part. So a lot of times when the students were having trouble with these unnecessary side topics, the teacher would just kind of suddenly and unpredictably drop the topic altogether, which on the one hand is a good thing because they shouldn't have been getting lost in those side topics to begin with. But on the other hand, some students invested a lot of time trying to wrap their head around stuff like molecular orbital theory, and then you just decided that all those worksheets and all that practice that they did, you just decided that you weren't going to grade any of those assignments anymore, and you basically made them waste their time. Well, I mean, in Rose's case, I don't think it was a total waste of time because she was eventually going to have to relearn it anyway. Rose wanted to go to med school, so she was going to have to grapple with molecular orbital theory at some point or another anyway. But anyway, I use the word anyway too much. What else? So yeah, those were two more big red flags. Rose and I were losing the lead we had against the rest of the class, and the class itself was also falling behind. But the other big red flag I noticed, and I guess this is the last one that I can think of, unless I think of other ones later, was just this pattern of escalation, for lack of a better term. It felt like maybe, just maybe, that Dr. Thorne was trying to challenge me through Rose. And in order to kind of explain what I mean by that, it's like she wanted to have the last word, and she wanted to, I don't know, establish herself as the one true authority on chemistry in Rose's mind or something like that. It was like, sometimes I felt like the ridiculous esoteric questions that she was giving Rose and the rest of her students weren't really directed at the students themselves, but were more directed at me as a sort of way to get me to back off or doubt my own abilities or whatever. Unfortunately for her, she decided to mess with the wrong tutor, because I'm quite experienced in dealing with people who try to make me give up. Oh, I can tell you stories. It isn't my first rodeo. But yeah, it just felt like every time she came up with a new challenge, and in my mind, I could imagine her going, aha, this will surely stop them. This will surely get them to give up and surrender. And then, Rose would come back the next day or the next week or whenever they had class next, and she would have learned from me how to understand and solve the problem, and the teacher would look at that and go, dang it, I need something bigger. I need something more difficult. I need something that will break them. And, that's just my personal interpretation of what was going on. Maybe you see something different in it, but that's how it was for me. I felt like just by meeting her challenges, we were in a way encouraging her to make the problems even worse, just because she was fixated on trying to get us to just surrender to her authority. Proof by intimidation is a very common proof technique used by professors. Oh, I forgot to mention, so Dr. Thorne used to be a college professor before she started teaching at this school. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more at a later time. Well, maybe later in this video. We'll see. We'll see when it's relevant to bring it up again. Actually, it probably will be relevant later. But yeah, at this point, I was pretty sure I knew what I was dealing with. At this point, I was fairly certain that this teacher was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. So now we enter what I would call phase 3, the fighting back phase, and also, the aftermath, what happened after that particular school year ended. So at this point, it was somewhere in the middle of the second semester. I was doing an online tutoring session with Rose, and she brought up once again, the self-doubt that she was feeling because of the words of her teacher, and I explained the concept of gaslighting to Rose. She had never heard that term before, so I explained to her what that was. And I also, reminded her that Dr. Thorne was, whatever she said about Rose not getting more than a 3 on the AP exam, I could reassure her that that wasn't the case. Rose was definitely going to get at least a 4 and had a pretty decent chance at getting a 5. And, the teacher's perspective on this was just wrong. Just outright wrong. And it was at this point that I also used the term sociopath to describe Dr. Thorne to Rose for the first time. And I remember Rose's immediate reaction after she heard me say that. Her mom was actually in the room at the time. She was just kind of walking around in the background. I think she was, I don't know, running errands or something. But yeah, I mentioned to Rose that I think I can say now for sure that Dr. Thorne is a sociopath. And Rose shouted, "Mom, my tutor thinks that Dr. Thorne is a sociopath." And then Rose's mom comes in and she kind of chuckles for a bit, but then, like her voice shifts in a way that kind of signified that she was taking it more seriously. Because Rose's parents had plenty of meetings with Dr. Thorne, and they also realized that something was off about Dr. Thorne, but they were still kind of like I was in the earlier phases, kind of still giving Dr. Thorne the benefit of the doubt. And, there was no... Because you don't want to just outright accuse someone of intentionally trying to undermine their students' confidence and, just utterly fail at teaching them on purpose. But I guess when she heard me say it, when she had that sort of second opinion to kind of corroborate what they were seeing, I think that was when Rose and her mom both kind of finally had that moment of, okay, we're not just seeing things. This teacher really is out of her mind. And, that's an empowering thing. When you're dealing with gaslighting, the best way to break out of it is to have, an outsider kind of corroborate how you're perceiving things. Tell you that it's not just you that's seeing things. People on the outside are also seeing the same thing. So if you can be that third person, well, not necessarily third person, you might be the fourth or the fifth, but I say third person because usually it's the gaslighter, the person being gaslit, if that's even a word, and then the third person, that's going to be you. Well, sometimes it's going to be you, sometimes you're the person being gaslit, and the third person is going to be your friend. But the point is, that third person that tells the gaslit person that they're being gaslit, that's usually going to be the person that helps them kind of break out of that helps them not be under the gaslighter's influence anymore. So whenever you're dealing with that kind of situation, just remember that. If you feel like you're losing your mind, if you feel like you might be going crazy, and you see bad intentions where the other person is claiming that, it's all in your head, try and find your third person. Try and find someone who sees the situation the same way you do, just to kind of reassure you that you're not just seeing things. And with more experience, maybe you won't even need that third person anymore, because ultimately the best way to overcome gaslighting is to just believe your own eyes and ears. If you can learn to trust yourself, then you don't even need that third person at all. But yeah, that was my side note on gaslighting. You didn't come here for a psychology lesson, but there you go. I'm not a professional psychologist or anything like that, so don't quote me on any of this. It's just my personal experience. Your mileage may vary, and all that other stuff. The typical disclaimer. But yeah, so after pointing out the gaslighting, Rose's mom decided to take some action and talk to the school principal, because, again, this teacher wasn't just hurting Rose with her bad practices. She was hurting the whole class. The whole class was falling behind and getting lost in all of these unnecessary topics. The main one that stands out to me being, again, molecular orbital theory. So Rose's mom goes to the principal and tells him about this and cites the specific example of molecular orbital theory, which isn't part of the course. There's even documentation that I showed to Rose confirming that it's not part of the course. I think the quote was, something about molecular orbital theory being, quote, beyond the scope of the course. And so, Rose's mom tries to explain this to the principal. The principal of this school just happens to have had experience with chemistry. So the principal kind of understands chemistry, and so when Rose's mom tells him that, Dr. Thorne is wasting time on unnecessary topics like molecular orbital theory, at first the principal was like, oh, I learned about orbitals and stuff like that, that's fine. And Rose's mom was like, no, that's hybrid orbital theory and the quantum mechanical model of the atom. That stuff is fine. This is molecular orbital theory. And so Rose's mom, because she also knows her chemistry, she's a chemical engineer, by the way, she was able to explain to the principal very clearly that Dr. Thorne was messing with a topic that is way beyond the level of your average high school student, or even your above average high school student for that matter. And that was the point where the principal was like, oh. And I guess the principal did something, because at that point Dr. Thorne finally started to try again, to try and finish the course. They didn't succeed, by the way. Spoiler. But yeah, that was one of the things that we did to kind of fight back. But, there was a little bit of an incident that highlights another sociopathic behavior. And I guess I should mention it now. So, there was something that Dr. Thorne later on didn't want to cover. She wanted to skip over it, and she claimed it was beyond the scope of the course. I wonder where she learned those words. But yeah, that's something that sociopaths will do frequently, is they'll just kind of start parroting your words back to you. And I've thought about this, and I think the reason they do this is because, whenever you're dealing with a sociopath and they say something and then you have that really good comeback, like they have the ability to understand that there was power in those words, that there was power in your comeback, but I think they fail to understand why your words had the impact that they did, and they just attribute it to the words themselves. And so, because it's natural for a sociopath to kind of seek power and authority, one way they'll do that is by trying to speak words that seem to have power and authority baked into them. So this is something that they do a lot of. You'll see it frequently if you ever have to deal with a sociopath, long term, like if the sociopath happens to be your teacher for a whole entire year. But yeah, that was an incident that happened. That was just another indicator, further confirmation that I made the right call by calling her a sociopath. What else? What other incidents occurred in this phase? Well, there was one more wild goose chase that kind of got dropped. Actually, I think this might have been related to the parroting incident. I don't quite remember. But there was one more little wild goose chase, and I think this was the last one before they just focused solely on stuff they were supposed to be covering. And it was the idea of a Schottky diode. So this is like kind of electrical engineering stuff that the students weren't really supposed to learn about. Again, just like molecular orbital theory, it was outside the scope of the course. The concept of the Schottky diode I did find mentioned in my chemistry textbook, I think, and it was, if I remember correctly, it was in one of those chapters that I call the FYI chapters in your typical chemistry textbook. Chapters like chemistry of the environment or chemical applications. I think it was in like that applications chapter, whatever it was actually called. It talks about things like NP junctions and Uh, what else? NP junctions, semiconductors, ceramics, a little bit of materials science here and there. Just kind of, extra stuff that's not very conceptual. It's just, hey, here are some real life applications of chemistry. And, it's there are definitely students who might have an interest in that, and there's nothing preventing you from reading those chapters if you want to, but when you're teaching a highly structured course like the AP Chemistry course, you don't have a lot of leeway to do that. So, it was something that they shouldn't have been getting lost in. And I think that may have been the topic that she just kind of suddenly dropped out of nowhere, claiming it was beyond the scope of the course. Maybe? I don't quite remember. I feel like it was something more important that she was dropping and claiming it was beyond the scope of the course just because she didn't want to teach it. My memories are a bit jumbled about that, but either way, it wasn't a good sign. Anyway, at this point, we also came to discover the source of all of those weird, wacky problems that I've been talking about. So get this, Rose actually gets all the credit for this because she was the one who was able to figure it out. See, Rose had mentioned to me a number of times that there were only a few students in the class that were managing to keep their heads above water in Dr. Thorne's AP Chemistry class, and those were like students who probably shouldn't have even been in that class to begin with, because the way Rose described them, they basically live and breathe chemistry, and they were just in a league of their own. They knew advanced math like linear algebra, so of course they weren't having as many problems as the rest of the class. Go figure. But yeah, she told me that they were on the, what do you call it? I think it was called like the International Chemistry Olympiad team for that school. Basically just this big competition. There are Olympiads for all of the subjects, I think. At least all of the sciences. I don't know about other subjects like English, but maybe there is an International English Olympiad. I didn't dig into it too much. But the point was, these students, they were like elite chemistry students. They were being taught outside of school by this, I guess, coach or instructor who was using a very advanced chemistry textbook for them. And it turns out that that's where the problems were coming from. I guess Rose somehow overheard one of them bringing up the fact that they had seen the exam questions before in their textbook or whatever, and she was like, "Give me the textbook, let me see." And she looked at it and it was like, oh my god, this is the source. This is where it's all coming from. And I guess she decided that the best plan of action was to buy herself a copy of the textbook and, plan ahead so that she wouldn't be caught off guard by Dr. Thorne's crazy esoteric questions anymore. And so, yeah, that was one problem nipped in the bud finally. But what else did I want to say? I've lost my train of thought again. Oh, right. This was something we considered, but we didn't actually go through with it. This was part of our fighting back plan. I guess we kind of just kept it as a backup because at this point Dr. Thorne was kind of starting to, do her job. But just in case, there was something else I found out that we could do, which was we could contact the college board and have them do a course audit, because AP Chemistry, the college board designed the curriculum for the course, so the teacher doesn't have too much freedom on what to cover. I just suspected that there had to have been something wrong with what the teacher was doing, getting lost in all of these unnecessary topics. There just had to be some sort of rule that the College Board had to prevent this from happening. And so I dug around and I found out that, yeah, in order to teach an AP course, teachers need to submit a syllabus before they start teaching the course, and the College Board reviews the syllabus, and, usually it's a simple process. It's like, okay, does the teacher plan to cover the topics that we want them to cover? If yes, great, stamp of approval. You are now a school that teaches AP whatever the course was. So yeah, that's known as the course audit. And of course, you can just contact the College Board if you suspect that a teacher isn't really following a syllabus that agrees with their goals for the course, and just have them, check how the course is going and what's being taught and whether or not it's, up to the standards established by the College Board. So, yeah, we had that option. We had the option of just contacting the College Board, so the course audit threat was another weapon in our arsenal. I don't think we ever ended up using it, though I did encourage Rose to just contact the College Board and see what happens. It's not like there's anything to lose, but, Rose was quite suspicious of the College Board. She didn't trust the College Board all that much, and I can't really blame her. The College Board is pretty shady. But, it was what it was. It was an option, and there wasn't really anything to lose, but I don't think we ended up using it in the end. So, yeah, that was around the time where things started to calm down. Then I got a second student from the same classroom. You see, Rose had been, I guess, mentioning me a lot to her classmates, and one of her classmates was interested because I guess the classmate will call her Blanc, which I think is French for white. Blanc wanted to get some tutoring towards the end of the school year just so that she could have a chance at the AP exam, because I think Blanc realized that the class wasn't going to finish the course, and the class didn't really leave her feeling prepared for the AP exam. So yeah, I saw Blanc for like 2, maybe 3 tutoring sessions. I feel like it might have been 3, maybe 4. But yeah, it was towards the end of the semester, and I think one of the first tutoring sessions I had with Blanc was one in which we covered chemical kinetics. Chemical kinetics? Well, I think it was like kinetics and equilibrium. That's where they were stuck towards the end of the school year. I don't think Dr. Thorne ever actually got to cover thermodynamics or nuclear chemistry or electrochemistry or organic chemistry. So that's 4 whole chapters, possibly more, that the class never finished in time for the AP exam. But anyway, I was mentioning to Blanc how, those, what do you call them? Those solubility equilibrium problems. I think that was covered in maybe video number 15 or 16 in my AP Chemistry playlist. I don't quite remember. But you may have, if you've seen those videos, you may have heard me mention that you can set up the equation for calculating the molar solubility of a substance in pure water in under 15 seconds. And I showed in the video that it's totally doable, and it's not as difficult of a standard to meet as you might think. In fact, a lot of students, once they get used to it, can probably get it done in under 5 seconds. But yeah, I mentioned to Blanc that she should be at the level where she can set it up in 15 seconds, and then I guess between that tutoring session and my next tutoring session with Blanc, she had mentioned to Rose during class. Rose just noticed her, really focused on something during class one day, and she was asking her, "What are you doing?" And Blanc replied, "Oh, I'm trying to get this done in under 15 seconds." And then somebody in the class overheard it and shouted, "We have to get it in 15 seconds?" And then the whole class just kind of panicked. I think I mentioned that story in the chemistry video where, again, I mentioned that 15-second rule, but maybe not. It's been a long time since I recorded that video. You can't expect me to remember everything I said in the video, especially if it's like side stories. But yeah, that was just kind of a little fun side thing. But also, it kind of gave me more confirmation that this teacher was just really failing her students badly. You know, getting to see how another student was affected by Dr. Thorne's antics really cleared any doubts that I may have had remaining in my mind about calling her a sociopath. So, yeah, then the AP exam happened. Rose did okay. She didn't get a 5, she got a 4. And the reason was more about her studies, had more to do with her study strategy than her content knowledge. In terms of content knowledge, I made sure she was as ready as can be. But in her own words, she said that she focused too much on studying free response questions and not enough on multiple choice, and that's what got her, unfortunately. But on the bright side, the college that she was applying to, she knew ahead of time, didn't take AP credit anyway, so she wasn't all that worried about it. She just kind of, you know, it would have been a nice slap to Dr. Thorne's face if Rose got a 5. Just, you know, to rub it in her face and show her how wrong she was. But, you know, unfortunately it didn't happen, and that was that. But at least Rose, you know, regained some of the confidence that Dr. Thorne had tried to take away from her. Next year comes along. Rose is now a senior at the same school, still runs into Dr. Thorne from time to time, and Dr. Thorne was not in a very good place at this point. Most of the class scored 1s and 2s on the AP exam, and the school administration wasn't too happy about this. Dr. Thorne is still working at the school, by the way. I did double check. So she hasn't been fired. That has more to do with a certain pattern that seems to keep on reoccurring at this particular school, but I'll talk about that later if I remember. So yeah, Dr. Thorne still not fired, but she kind of got, I guess you could say, demoted in a way, because there was now, if I'm remembering the details correctly, there was now another chemistry teacher who was doing one of the AP chemistry classes while Dr. Thorne was teaching the other one. I think that's how they had it set up. And Dr. Thorne had wanted to teach all of the AP chemistry or something like that, but instead she was stuck teaching some of the lower chemistry classes. I don't quite remember, but the point is, Dr. Thorne didn't get to teach all the classes that she wanted in that following year. And, you know, I took that as a minor victory, so, you know, it could have been better, but I'll take what I can get. Let me see. What else happened? Oh, well, I would consider it plagiarism, but the plagiarism incident, or pseudo-plagiarism. At one point, Rose showed me this article that Dr. Thorne had typed up and was trying to promote on the school website or something along those lines. And it was something about science not being very creative or something like that, or not being innovative enough anymore. And, it was this sort of, how do I say this? I don't have the right words for this, but it was kind of like this lamenting article talking about the sad state of science education or whatever. And, I found it to be amusing. I didn't take it too seriously, but I did notice that in the beginning of the article, she mentioned a couple of, I don't even know how to say this, examples of, I forget if they were quotes from scientists or examples of what famous scientists did in the past or something like that. But, something about it just kind of made my spidey senses tingle, for lack of a better term. And I thought, you know what? Sociopaths usually will decide whether or not to do something bad based on whether or not they think anybody's looking and whether they think they can get away with it. So I dared to click the link to the article that she was citing, and some of the words in her article were basically lifted verbatim from the article she was citing. And I guess, yeah, technically she cited the article, so it may not be plagiarism, but at the same time, it's the way she worded it, you would have thought, if you didn't care to look at the article, you would have thought they were her own words. So even if it's technically still legal, there's still something that feels very wrong about it. Something that just felt like you didn't even try. And, this was in the middle of yet another online tutoring session with Rose. She had me look at it, and, I just clicked on the article and noticed the same exact words for, the opening paragraph of Dr. Thorne's article versus somewhere towards, I think, the second or third paragraph of the cited article. And I show this to Rose, and she has this good laugh at it at the beginning, and then she was like, "How did you know?" And I told her, it's like, I know sociopaths. I know how they think. They think that nobody's going to check the references, nobody's going to, nobody's going to enforce the rules, so she thought she could get away with it. And that's why I know whenever I'm dealing with someone who might be a sociopath, I know to double check the things that I normally just take for granted and, I guess, trust. I just knew not to trust. I just thought it would be worth clicking on the article just to see if there was anything shady going on. And I guess I dug up a little bit of a treasure trove. So, that was a funny incident in the aftermath of the whole Dr. Thorne debacle. And I guess finally, the Rate My Teacher reviews. So Rose was the one who pointed me to this website. I had heard of Rate My Professor before, but I hadn't heard of Rate My Teacher. And she pointed me to some of the reviews of Dr. Thorne, and oh boy, I remember having a good laugh at them. I tried to look for them before recording this video, and I can't find them anymore, because it turns out that I guess some teachers complained about Rate My Teacher being too unfair, and I think it was last year or maybe the year before, Rate My Teacher got bought by another company, and they got rid of all of the old reviews, and they've made the review system a lot more rigid now. So long gone are all the funny reviews, but I vaguely remember back when Rose showed me some of Dr. Thorne's reviews on Rate My Teacher, I remember one of them being incredibly sycophantic. This student thought Dr. Thorne was the best teacher of all time. And on the one hand, I was like, this student might be just as crazy as the teacher, if not crazier. But on the other hand, I was like, I can see how a sociopath would set that up. Because one thing that sociopaths like to do is they like to find their sycophants. They like to, treat at least one, maybe two or three people in the group really, really well so that they can have those people, as backup to vouch for them and say that they're basically the nicest person in the world. Whenever you hear somebody being described as the nicest person in the world, be a bit skeptical, be careful, be cautious, and, try to really focus and suss out that person's character, because there is no nicest person in the world, at least not as far as I'm concerned. But, that was just something I had a good laugh at, because, I understood it. I can see how behind closed doors, a teacher can say all sorts of mean things to one student, but also say a lot of nice things behind closed doors to a different student, and then you have these two completely opposite stories, and it makes it harder for an outside observer to figure out what's truly going on. And yeah, that's how the smarter sociopaths keep on getting away with their schemes. They make it harder for outsiders to, figure out what's going on and, discern their bad intent. They really capitalize on, our natural desire to give people the benefit of the doubt. That's just how they operate. So yeah, it's unfortunate what happened to Rate My Teachers, because I would have loved to just kind of, if I quoted verbatim, maybe it is a blessing in disguise, because if I had quoted verbatim what the reviews were, you probably would have been able to identify the teacher and the school, and there are some really creepy people online who can, kind of narrow down the list of potential people and figure out exactly who was involved in this story, despite my use of fake names for everybody. And you don't want to open that up. You don't want to open up the opportunity for that. So I guess it's actually a blessing in disguise. But yeah, what else did I want to mention? Oh, finally, the school. So Rose had told me some rather interesting stories and pointed me to some real articles about real incidents with this school. And I think it partly explains why Dr. Thorne still has a job at this school today. Apparently there were some... how do I say this? There were multiple incidents of teachers engaging in inappropriate behavior with students at this school, and of course subsequently getting fired, because when the news is paying attention, you have no choice but to fire those teachers. So I guess I just kind of want to analyze why this might be a recurring pattern at this particular school. And I think the reason ultimately stems from it being a private school. A private school doesn't have to follow the same, hiring standards set by the state. If they want, they can hire someone just for being, the principal's cousin or whatever, even if they don't really have the credentials or qualifications for the job. Private schools can pretty much do whatever they want in terms of the teachers they hire. They can set their own standard. And I think that's what opens it up to some of these, how shall I call them, unscrupulous people. I think the people that can't get into a normal school with their qualifications because they can't pass a background check or something like that, well, maybe they can pass a background check, but they can't pass other tests, let's say. I think they naturally gravitate towards the schools that aren't going to, well, not just the schools, but the employers in general, because this isn't a school exclusive problem. This happens at any workplace. They'll naturally gravitate towards any employer that has lower hiring standards because, well, that's how they can sneak in undetected. Usually they don't have any other choice, or they have less options because other companies will, thoroughly research your background and figure out, or at least try their best to figure out exactly who you are before they hire you. And if you have some shady things in your past, if you've got skeletons in your closet, then you'd probably want to go somewhere that isn't going to look in your closet to begin with, or a place that's less likely to look in your closet. So I think that might partly explain why there were so many of these scandals at this particular school, and that's probably why Dr. Thorne still has a job there, is because the school standards are just not high enough when it comes to who they're hiring. I guess they hire based on credentials, but they fail to look at character. And if you're ever going to become a business owner, character is what you should hire for. A person with good character, even if they don't have the skills, if they have good character, they're going to be naturally motivated to learn the skills. But if you have somebody who has the skills but doesn't have good character, they're going to be the death of your company. Just keep that in mind if you ever decide to become an employer one day. But yeah, I think that's everything. Was there anything else I wanted to comment on? Oh, right. So I guess I should have mentioned this way earlier in the video, but one of my other reasons for initially giving Dr. Thorne the benefit of the doubt was that she had previously been teaching college students, so maybe she was just having a hard time, toning things down. Maybe she was so used to teaching college students and she overestimated the abilities of high school students because of that. But, given what you've heard now from the rest of the story, I don't think many of you are going to buy that as an excuse for how she treated the class. But, it was another thought that ran through my mind towards the beginning of that school year before I had, felt more certain that Dr. Thorne was a sociopath. But yeah, that's the end of the story. If there's anything else I'm forgetting, maybe I'll mention it in a pinned comment or in the description or something. But that's the story for now. Hope you enjoyed it. If you recognize this pattern in one of your teachers, don't be too early to call them out, and actually don't call them out to their face, because they already know how to deny, and make you look like the bad guy or make you look like you're crazy. But, if you have a similar situation going on in your classroom, know how to recognize the signs and know how to combat the gaslighting. Again, remember to get your third person perspective. Remember to find your third person to help you kind of check whether or not you're seeing things the way you think you're seeing them. And, come up with a battle plan. Try your best to fight back if you can. It's a mind game, so you have to think strategically, you have to plan ahead, and you have to... I would prioritize survival over victory when it comes to these sorts of cases, because if you get too fixated on victory, they know how to use that against you, especially if you're, a young student versus an experienced sociopathic teacher. And, try and get someone who knows what they're doing involved. Rose had me and her parents and some of her classmates, and you're going to need that too. You're going to need somebody else, somebody who knows how these shady people operate to kind of work with you and help you figure out your battle plan. But yeah, if you're in that unfortunate scenario, try your best to survive and hang in there, and maybe one day you'll have a story that you can share with people and they'll have a good laugh at your crazy teacher's expense. So it's not all bad, and surviving it can strengthen you in certain ways. But yeah, that's the story, so hope you enjoyed it. This has been Al the Tutor, reminding you once again that ignorance is not bliss. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.